Welcome to the Radiant Energy Summit, where you'll learn the top insights and strategies for nurturing and optimizing your energy on all levels of your being. Our guest today is Greg Hitter. In addition to his work as a clinical psychologist, Dr. Hitter is an adjunct professor at the California Graduate Institute and has traveled throughout the U.S., Europe, and Asia, lecturing to scientific and medical groups. He's currently the director of the Self-Questing Center for Whole Being in San Luis Obispo, California. Greg has studied the human psyche for almost 3 decades through related subjects of ancient wisdom, which involve research into consciousness, mystical experience, parapsychology, and the study of the religious and shamanic practices of many varying cultures around the world. From these studies, Greg developed an expanded view of our therapeutic needs that go well beyond psychology's limited view of the psyche that grew out of the old science and that neglected much of the knowledge in ancient wisdom in terms of consciousness and the interconnectedness of all things. Part of his work includes the development of a new modality aimed at healing states of consciousness. He calls it self-questing, and it allows oneself to explore and integrate emotions, memories, and what he calls soul fragments that prevent us from being fully alive and healthy beings. Greg is also an expert in essential oils and how they help us transform our chi and support this process of moving towards the wholeness of self. We are pleased to have him with us today. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
You're very welcome. So how did you begin your work? What drew you into this whole thing of what you call self-questing?
Well, I've always had an interest, even as a child, in people's, I had a sensitivity, shall we say, to people's emotional well-being or state. And from that, developed toward the end of high school a sense that maybe psychology or psychiatry might be a direction, or medicine. And when I got into college, I did study pre-med and eventually getting more into the science end of it. But gradually coming around again to the study of psychology and the elaboration of that and its concept of the schizoid or splitting self, and the idea of wholeness around that, and wholeness of one's conscious being, one's self-awareness, self with a capital S, as Jung refers to it, the unity of the potential unity of our spirit or conscious beingness. And when that's in wholeness, then wellness is expressed on all levels, including in our chi, which is the energetic infrastructure that influences the expression of the body and the mind, and through what Jung calls synchronicity, the outer world and how it manifests at you and around you.
So you speak of wholeness, and you mentioned on all levels. Can you expand on what you mean by on all levels?
Well, the concept of a sort of four-tiered leveling or dividing of reality isn't something that's new. It comes from ancient wisdom and shamanic and magical practices from the mystical Kabbalah. And it's the concept that everything manifests out of consciousness, out of the great cosmic consciousness of all it is, the oneness of all conscious being. And that then elaborates into energy of various forms, including chi, that then becomes the energetic infrastructure for the expression of the body and the mind and even the outer world. And so wholeness isn't some vague mystical term. It speaks to being undivided, unfragmented in one's conscious self, in the self. And that's what my work developed out of. When it developed out of clinical psychology, it developed out of the concept coming from dynamic psychiatry, of the schizoid self, or the splitting self. Schizoid is just their fancy term for the tendency of one's consciousness, one's self, to split or fragment under trauma and take a part of the self and stuff it in the unconscious for a protective holding. unfortunately, that kind of division of the self creates dis-ease. It may resolve the threat of the trauma at the time, but from then on, because you're fragmented, you're not in wholeness, and therefore you're not in wellness or well-being.
Fascinating. So what you're really referring to is, and I'll turn it into a question, are essentially most of the maladies of today, mind, body, etc., due to this fragmentation that you're talking about?
I think the expression of one's life is entirely dependent on the state, the relative state of wholeness or fragmentation of one's conscious being, one's self-awareness or self. The more fragmented and the way one is fragmented is how that division, that divisiveness, that lack of wholeness is expressed in the life. And the way that, to the degree, shall we say, that one is whole, that gets expressed in one's life. And that includes the energy, the body, the mind, as well as one's outer world and the influence of one's consciousness on the outer world.
Cool. So let's tune into energy now. You know, what our subject is all about. What is energy to you? What does it mean?
Well, when I think of energy, I think of the term morphogenic field, which Rupert Sheldrake drew from another source. And it's morphogenic means form shaping. And so when I think of subtle energy and what some call the aura of the body mind, it's an infrastructure of energy that is directed and manifests out of consciousness, but that then becomes the infrastructure for the body and the mind and how wholeness or wellness or dis-ease manifests in the body and the mind and the life of a person. So it's an imprint, it's a blueprint, if you will, of how that expression is going to occur.
So energy helps form the blueprint, you're saying?
Yeah, in a way it is the blueprint. It's what the DNA of our cells, for instance, read. It's what the emotions and thoughts that are created in our mind are formed out of. It represents the state of one's conscious being in its relative wholeness or fragmentation.
Yeah, so you're giving a new definition to energy, and I love it because we're not talking about just physical energy, obviously, right?
Right. I think there are many kinds of even subtle energy, but we're not talking necessarily about electricity or electromagnetism the way that most physicists talk about it, although it's not that entirely different either, because if you study, as I did, the great physicists of the past, like Niels Bohr, who developed the model of the atom, his family's coat of arms had the yin and yang symbol. And he and many former scientists and physicists have used the concepts, the metaphysical concepts of ancient wisdom and postmodern science in their sense of reality and the underpinnings of it. For instance, in quantum physics and chaos science now that have developed over the last 100 years.
So thank you for expanding our understanding or the meaning of energy. And so in terms of radiance, what is radiance to you? Because you have mentioned it many times in the work that I've done with you as the consciousness expands.
Well, I think when one's conscious being and it's the energy that comes out of that is in wholeness and wellness, it radiates much like the sun radiates in space. It radiates the light of one's being, one's awareness in every direction. And when the gravity of one's life situation becomes so great, just like a black hole in outer space, when the gravity of a sun gets too great and sucks the light of the sun into it, and creates a black hole, we too can create these internal black holes in ourselves.
Yeah.
When the gravity of the situation becomes so great that we split off a part of us and implode into our internal universe.
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this before. There's a word for that. It's called lacuna, Lacuna, and what it means is it's like a black hole in the mind. It's a blind spot. We can't even see something that's almost right in front of us because whatever part of us, like you say, fragmented off or is blocking our awareness of it. And that's not an uncommon thing for things that we become overwhelmed with. And so
we see the symptoms and the effects of that lack of wholeness, that lacuna, as you call it, in negative emotional states, negative thoughts, negative sense of identity, negative behaviors, and compulsions, and all kinds of unconscious, or rather conscious effects that are unconscious in their origin.
Yes. Yeah. So what do you feel, in your experience, holds people back most from experiencing their radiance?
Well, I think it is this purposeful fragmenting of self.
When you say purposeful, can you explain what you mean by purposeful?
Well, I think it's intended to protect. When a person is touched by life in a way that is experienced as frightening and traumatic, that fear becomes sort of the gravity that sucks the light of one's being or part of it into it. And so all of this fragmentation is fear-based, and yet at the time, of course, it's a protective mechanism. But the problem is that it creates this lack of wholeness, this lack of wellness.
Yeah.
And
so
that isn't intended, but the purpose originally was to protect, typically.
Got it. Yeah, that's what I was after there. So in other words, that we don't purposely cause ourselves problems, but we purposely self-protect, yes, to avoid the pain that we just experienced that caused the fragmentation.
Right.
Wow. And so I've shared this in some of the other interviews and a lot of people that I work with, and that is that purposeful fragmenting has a positive intent to it. In other words, not only will you someday get a time when you have the wherewithal, the compassion for the self and the awareness to bring it back up, but also the gifts that it has brought you to, the learnings, the teaching, the wisdom that you'd otherwise never have gotten had you not fragmented, or had you never had the experience of what caused the trauma that created the fragmentation. So that's pretty awesome stuff. So maybe you can shine some light on that. In relation to the purposeful fragmenting, what have you noticed that the people, as they go through the stages of self-questing, that it brings them? The awareness shifts, in other words.
Well, it's not unusual in the first several sessions for a person to unload an overload of fragmented self that has been holding them down, anchoring them in the expression of some kind of pain in their body, their mind, their life. And oftentimes it's reflected emotionally in overt fear or anxiety or depression, but also even expressed physically in the body as states of disease. And so in those first sessions, it's what I've often thought of as the bells and whistles of self-questing, because there's a lot of that heavy blanket of fragmentation is lifted, and people begin to see the light and start having some hope that they didn't have before.
Yeah.
And hopelessness is very much a quality, a characteristic of fragmentation.
Yeah. I was hearing you say that before you said it. Yeah, that hopelessness is a clear sign of something that's fragmented. Because I've asked you this question many times, Greg. How do you know when you're fragmented? And how would you answer that question?
Well, again, it's sort of like, where does it hurt? You know you're fragmented when you start seeing symptoms in your body, your mind, your life, your relationships, whatever, that are uncomfortable, that are blocking you, that are you sense are preventing fulfillment. And those are the doorways that we use to go in and connect with that trapped awareness that's behind it and bring light to light, bring the light, the consciousness, the light of the person's consciousness to that fragmented part of them in the unconscious. Mm. And so right then and there, you begin that process of joining with that separate trapped awareness. And these symptoms are just that trapped awareness calling to us. Here I am, come and get me.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a means to go in and get it, it's going to create more and more trauma and drama in your life or in your body-mind until it gets the recognition that it seeks, which is unity. Yeah.
And without getting too deep, too fast here, my experience of your work and the almost indefatigability of how you work with people, whether that be in personal session or in class environments, what I've noticed, Greg, about how you do the work, so to speak, is that you hold this enormous, this beautiful compassion for everybody in the space. That then allows the person to notice with that awareness, that light that you're talking about, which we could talk at least a half an hour on. And it helps the person suddenly realize that it's not about a dark thing anymore. It's not about a negative emotion anymore. That it's trapped awareness. I love how you're shedding light on just those words. That it's all that's all that it is, and that. Yeah. So maybe you can expand on that just a little bit. Like, so what that part is asking us to do is what? The part that's trapped is asking us to
recognize it, to become aware of it, because even though it's felt a need to go into disunity and fragment off and go into this protective holding or withholding, it still longs for unity. This is a fundamental drive in consciousness to unite within itself, unite with others, unite with cosmic consciousness. But that is a fundamental drive of the human spirit.
That's something. If you're taking notes, people that are listening to this, like I just took a note for myself here. It longs for unity, and that's beautiful. So it may feel like pain, all the symptoms, Greg, that you started touching on. And if you want to share a few more symptoms, like, what are the markers of what a fragmented part feels like, looks like, that whole thing, that would really help us. Knowing that as those symptoms are showing themselves, they are in like a divine order that they're presenting themselves. They're messages from the body. Like in Chinese medicine, they say that the subconscious and the body are sending us messages all the time. It's training ourselves to listen. In other words, it's helping us slow down. So what are the signs when we start slowing down? And even if we're not yet slowed down, that are markers for this, for that.
Well, a typical characteristic of fragmentation is the need for control. Aside from the pain, both physical, mental, behavioral, there's this fundamental drive of a need to control, and there is this incredible sense of absence too, because part of one's spirit being, one's consciousness, is gone, and there is that sense of absence. Mm. Somewhere on some level, we're always whole. We're in that self that Jung called self with a capital S, the potential of our conscious being. Others might call it the higher self or the Christed self, or knowledge and conversation with a holy guardian angel. There are many labels for it coming from many cultures and directions and religious orders. But when that self is fragmented, there's a sense of absence, a sense of something lacking. It creates a spiritual crisis. Mm. And that discomfort is the thing. That's the part calling. That's the doorway to the part. And what we do then is just get curious. Start asking questions. This fragmentation has created discomfort and dis-ease on some level, usually many levels of one's being. And so there may be some resentment. There's undoubtedly going to be some resistance to connecting with it and going in and investigating it, because it's natural to defend against that. That's why the part was split off in the first place.
Yeah.
So while there is this fundamental desire to reunite, there's also this sort of external shell around that withdrawn consciousness that is defensive. And so as it calls through the pain, it also defends and protects, in a sense,
Yes.
the pain, through the fear, through the hope.
Yeah, I call that like the comfort zone, effect, where even though we know like what we want, or what love might feel like, or like I deserve peace, there is that fallback to like default mode and the comfort zone of like, well, I'm just kind of like here. This is why change. That's going to wreck the status quo, right? No, because the status quo, of course, is pain in some cases, and it's trying to send us a message and a signal. And I think the odyssey that we're in the midst of it is that as we start listening to this trapped wholeness, is that we start getting a little clearer on what it is that those messages are, and then how to resolve it. If we try to do too much for ourselves and not work with someone like you, then we're lost in the familiarity. The lens that we see through is still kind of glazed, So
it's difficult because you're self-questing. The process and the goal is all about awareness, and awareness is the thing you're using to observe with, and that's the thing you're working on. And that's the thing that is partly fragmented and so shaded from awareness.
Yeah.
It's like a surgeon operating on his own hand. There's an inherent difficulty there. So having someone who can be objective, hold a non-threatening space that doesn't force but goes wherever the person's system is ready to go, that should be enough to be a mirror for that person to be able to see these lacuna, as you say, these black holes of the self, and to begin to connect with them. And through that curiosity and communication, get to the point where you can get that trapped separate awareness to release and shine out back into freely radiant conscious oneness with the conscious self. And then you see that new wholeness on the level of consciousness integrate into the energetic structure, into the mind, the body, and it start to express itself as well in the outer world of the person as wellness, wealth, healing, all of those, holiness, all of those words in the English language come from the same root word, whole, W-H-O-L-E. And that isn't some vague mystical term. That speaks specifically to being whole in one's conscious being.
Yeah.
When you have that, then you have a sense of a sacred, meaningful life, an abundant life of health, of wealth and wellness, and overall well-being.
Yes. In my experience with your work, there were at least a few sessions that I've done with you that I remember having these like epiphany moments of understanding how is it, first of all, that I made it through some of those events, and two, like what was there with me that while it fragmented for a specific reason. It like told me such a story of like, oh, this makes sense. Everything makes sense because of this now. It's like it's a generative shift. And what I mean by generative is like one piece tells you the whole puzzle. Whoa.
Yeah, it's holographic. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Like Bohm talks about, David Bohm, and the implicate order. And so the beauty of that is that it's not hard to get to. It doesn't take hundreds of sessions. It doesn't take even necessarily dozens. In my experience, it depends on what you're willing to explore. And so when it comes to when a person feels negative thoughts or emotions, what do you suggest that they do?
Well, I think it's helpful at that point to engage some process as a tool to investigate, to connect with the consciousness that's behind that distress, that difficulty, and communicate with it find out the who, what, where, when, and why of how that, about that consciousness, and then release it either back into wholeness with that individual, or sometimes it's foreign consciousness. It's someone else's who maybe was around and participating at the time of the trauma. Those foreign consciousnesses don't belong in our unconscious either. Those can be released, and their negative effects can be released, and they can go back to where they belong, and release into wholeness with others, with where they belong.
Yeah.
And that has its effect. I've had some amazing experiences related to me secondhand by people who have released foreign consciousness in that way.
Right. And, when you say foreign, that shows up in many different ways. In my experience, it's something that came in when I was experiencing a traumatic experience. And you asked me this question, and I was about 3 or 4 years old, by the way, when I was witnessing it. And you said, well, that must have been pretty rough, or like almost a terrifying experience for that 3-4-year-old in you. And I said, no, actually it wasn't. And you said, it wasn't? And you were curious about it. And I said, no. And now that you're saying that, Greg, that's really interesting. And you said, okay, so let's find out is there another consciousness that's there? And I was watching my dad suffer through something, and suddenly it dawned on me, oh my grandfather's awareness, his consciousness was there in that part that had been trapped for all these years, that had brought me gifts, but also was splintered. It was still holding its own, what would you call it, Greg? Its own, like, life force that was, in a way, not fully whole for me, which is ironic, because this guy was a great guy, and I've had great connect with him for many years, but I never knew him due to another tragedy that happened in his life. And so
Well, you knew him through your father.
Yes.
And these ancestral sorts of handing downs to the lineage, that can happen from generation to generation to generation.
Right.
That kind of fragmentation can collect, in a particular fragment or lacuna that then expresses itself in the body-mind energy system of that being.
And I'm just aware of why I just shared that, and that is because instead of the old adage of the sins of the father become the sins of the son kind of thing, it's like, wait a minute, no, I was spared that by watching something that wasn't directly hitting me. The reason why was because this part of me was saying, hey kid, I got your back. And it was taking it on.
Yeah.
And so when enough of that happens in one's life where you're still holding that energy, because that part is still taking things on, and it feels trapped after a while, you don't know how to do it, then you work with someone like you in the skillful hands, and suddenly, and I felt the breath of fresh air that just came through me, like, wow, and I cried, and it was a solemn cry. It was the kind where, oh my God, you met your maker in that moment, This is profound stuff. It's beyond words. It's almost ineffable. And yet we all have had experiences or long for experiences like that, because there's wholeness there. And that is what your work is all about. And I truly appreciate that. So
that's the consciousness, the spirit, the self, beyond the implicate order, beyond the chi and energy that really infrastructures that chi.
Yeah. So speaking of wholeness,
the chi manifests even.
Yeah, so speaking of wholeness, let's talk more about wholeness. What is it to you? I know you touched on it before, but I love how you not just define it, but how you embody it. What is wholeness to you?
Well, again, it's being undivided in the self. It's freely radiant conscious oneness, without, any black holes in the self, any parts that have withdrawn, that have splintered. That's wholeness. And that then will get reflected on what I consider the lower levels of one's being, the energetic infrastructure, the mind and the body, and then even synchronously the outer world, and how it manifests at you or how you move in it and create.
And how it reflects back to you, in other words. Yeah.
So wholeness is freely radiant conscious being. That then creates the wellness, the health, the wealth, the holiness in oneself and in one's life.
Yeah.
So the outer world reflects the inner self, or the state of the self. And if it's in the way and to the extent that it's whole, it reflects that wholeness, and in the way that one is fragmented, the outer world reflects that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So, what would you say to someone who has tried to shift their consciousness to get back to wholeness because they know they're not at some level, and they haven't experienced the shift in the way that they're like hearing about it, going, "Wow, wholeness sounds so cool that Greg's talking about."
I guess I missed what you're asking there.
What would you say to someone who's tried to shift their consciousness and hasn't experienced that shift of wholeness? They don't feel it.
Then there's something missing in the process that they're using. I think there are many approaches to this, and of course every fragment is different. But if you get a good facilitator who knows how to go in and quest for that part of the self and release it, that's certainly very helpful. Sometimes energy tools, essential oils are chemistry, but foundationally, I think they carry a vibration. They're a vibrational medicine,
Yes.
if you will, that creates a shift on that deep level of the energetic infrastructure, or it can. And sometimes just that alone will cause a triggering of a release of consciousness.
Yes.
Of trapped awareness that can then come back into radiance, wholeness, and then, manifest permanently in the body-mind. If that energetic tool fails at that, it still might change the symptom in the body-mind or the outer life, but it may not be permanent. If the consciousness is still back there behind it, saying something different than that energetic tool or that affirmation that you're using, your affirmation or what the vibrational tool is affirming might say one thing, and the unconscious might say, "Oh no, you're not." and so it's going to be back in there like a perpetual motion machine, just constantly creating the task it's taken on back in that trauma, trying to protect itself.
Yes. Yeah.
And until you shed the light of your awareness on it and release it, and once you become aware of anything in your unconscious, you gain power over it. You can release it. And so if a person's method or tool is failing, I would look at that there's something that's not coming to consciousness, to awareness sufficiently to release that deep foundational level of trapped awareness.
Yes.
Now, many fragments can feed into a given issue. So a person may be on the path of even releasing parts, but an issue will persist. But if you look closely, and usually the person doesn't have to look too closely to realize that with each time that issue presents after they've released a fragment or had some healing around it, each time it presents again, its nature, its character will have shifted. And that's because the quality of the consciousness that was feeding into it has changed.
Yes.
And now what's left is different, less than what it was before.
Right. Yep.
But typically you'll see a positive move, although sometimes as a person becomes more whole, and you see this particularly in the third phase of one's self-questing work, as they become more whole, there's more of them there to feel the pain. And so when a part rises up to awareness to be released, it can create a lot of acute disturbance, emotionally, even outwardly, but certainly inwardly. And it's kind of odd that at this stage, the third stage, it's not unusual for a person to find it difficult to connect with their facilitator or their process of investigating and releasing. I think it's sort of like, they're back, and there's a resistance there too.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the feelings, the pain is usually quite acute.
Yes.
So there's some resistance around that too.
Yeah, I'm typing notes in here, and what I'm just getting is like a false negative. Like, in other words, like it's wait a minute, I did all this journey and now I'm still feeling pain. Wait, the pain's even worse now? So,
well, there's the hopelessness coming up with the part too.
yeah,
Hopelessness, the fear, the doubt. That's another big characteristic of fragmentation, doubt. And what I say to a part or a client when I encounter it in the process is, I think that doubt and skepticism is overall a good thing. I say, go ahead, be doubtful, be skeptical, but also be doubtful and skeptical of your doubt and skepticism. Just enough to allow yourself the experience. Because once a part releases and comes into wholeness, then it knows. It can always go back and fragment again and protect itself.
Yeah.
But if you can just convince it to try the experience and support that consciousness, let it know through the client or through the facilitator that it's going to be all right, that it'll feel much better once it comes into wholeness, then it will be willing to try that experiment and see for itself. There's no need to believe. There's no need. It's not about belief. It's about experiencing the self and seeing for oneself what the shift that's positive.
Yes. And for myself and for people that I know that have experienced your work, I can see that shift. Sometimes it's like immediate. Sometimes it may take, minutes, sometimes hours. Usually it doesn't take days. For me, it hasn't taken days at all. I just notice this feeling, this shift. And then as I go into my next day or so, the same triggers aren't creating the same old response. And that's when there's something that's definitely cleared. And I mean, we're talking months later, same triggers, different response. And that is such a powerful indicator of wholeness and something that is cleared.
Well, consciousness and subtle energy are really the butterflies in Brazil that caused the tornadoes in Texas. They're very subtle. The vibrational effects of essential oils and cold lasers and other vibrational tools are very, very subtle.
Yeah.
But they're foundational.
Yes.
They get to or near the source, and that's the power of their effect. And that's why they can, once the consciousness is released in particular, these vibrational tools, when properly applied, can really help that integration of that wholeness of consciousness then into the energy, the mind, the body, and the outer world. Make it much quicker and easier. I noticed that as soon as I started using good quality essential oil in that process of after the release of trapped awareness, in that process of integration, that it went much more quickly, much easier. There weren't all the storms and that the person went through.
Yeah.
Like a cleansing reaction in a fast or something. It just moves you through so much more quickly through the whole system to integrate that wellness.
Yeah, completely agree. In my own experience, my life partner of many, many years, when she passed, instead of dropping down into depression or the many emotions that we feel when someone leaves us, I had my oils spread out on the table. I had a couple of my favorite books. I had a person named Greg Hitter, all part of my little team, my little spiritual advisory team. And I remember noticing that my vibration, my feelings, my mood never dropped any lower than just maybe 1 or 2 days below. I just didn't feel forlorn. I felt it for a moment, and it almost disappeared within moments of just sitting and just noticing, there's a part of me that feels kind of forlorn, hopeless, wow, interesting. I even spoke to it. Yeah, maybe I can check out too. Maybe I'll leave the planet too. And it was just accepting it that helped. But having the oils around me, having these tools of consciousness, as you're talking about, made all the difference. And I appreciate not only your self-questioning work, but your wisdom with the knowing of how to not just apply oils, but how to become one with them. And there's wholeness right there, Greg. The oils are whole by themselves. Their vibration is so much higher than most of our standard awareness, And what you also teach is how to access the intelligence of those oils. And I truly am grateful for the many lessons that you share with me about that. We could do a whole separate interview on just that. But I thank you for bringing up essential oils because they're beautifully crafted vibrational tools.
Yeah. around the grief that you just mentioned, even when a part releases and comes into wholeness, oftentimes a grieving process is precipitated, particularly if that part comes up around a situation of loss.
Yeah.
Like someone close. Grief may be a necessary part of integrating that consciousness. I find that people who are heavily fragmented and fragmented in a certain way have difficulty grieving. So they sit and smolder in suffering rather than grieving and moving through it.
Okay.
Whereas releasing the fragments around that typically allows a person to move through it.
That's good, Greg. Yeah. And so it's a different kind of grief.
Yeah.
It's like when you ask the question, instead of asking someone like, do you have any grief in your life? You could ask the question, so is there anything grieving you? That's a different way. Is there anything that's like kind of weighing you down? That has you in, it might not even be sadness, but like, what's another definition of grief to you?
Suffering.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Like the feeling of I'm not myself. I feel disconnected. This is a weird feeling. It's like a pathos, it's just, I can't, what is it that's holding me back from feeling whole or real or myself? And many of us have been through that. Even there are many advanced practitioners, Greg, that you and I know that have been doing this for a long time, and they still fall into those moments. And I'm in awe of that, because no matter how advanced we think we are, we almost start from scratch the next morning when we get out of bed, And it's a series of initiations of consciousness. It's not like you have to suffer all over again, but you hear the whatever part that speaks, and you step back and you go, okay, no problem. Take a nice deep breath, and you hear the wisdom then come in, and it fills in those spaces, because we're expanding as we speak. You, me, all of us, and those expansions, I think, are bringing up parts of us that we didn't even know in lifetimes that we could release, that didn't serve us any longer.
Well, I think really that's one of the prime purposes of life, is the flowering of the self in that way. That we're meant to flower like the lotus blooming,
Yeah.
Through our consciousness, our spirit, our self-awareness. And through that, we get beyond the angst, beyond the suffering, beyond the pain,
right,
beyond the disease.
Right. There's a phrase that you and I once spoke about, and we kind of coined this phrase, the tipping point of awareness. And maybe you can talk about that, because you've mentioned the word awareness now throughout this. It's been the theme. And can we define awareness, first of all? What is it? How do what does it feel like when you become aware of something?
Well, in a way, it's not definable. Because consciousness is really that thing that can't be measured.
Yeah.
The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
It's no thing. It's nothingness. It's not a thing that can be named. We talk about it as consciousness or self or awareness, that kind of thing. But really, it can't be defined. Fine meaning made finite. I think the word that comes to mind for me in response to your question is sentience, which means to be self-aware. And so it isn't just aware of objects or stimulus or of some kind. It's an actual awareness of one's own awareness of being aware.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the essence of being aware of oneself, in juxtaposition to all the other objects that can be named apart from oneself. I don't know if that helps you.
Yes, actually
in
does.
answering that question.
Yeah, and I understand that there are some words or some experiences in life that must be experienced first in order to know it. And while we are approaching the stadium of awareness, when you're on the outskirts, when you're giving the usher your tickets, you can kind of hear and feel the vibration of what are those people feeling? And that's good to know that there is a field there, and every once in a while,
intimation.
Yes, right. And every once in a while, you can kind of stumble into awareness, because you kind of go like, wow, that's suddenly I have a new understanding. That might be another definition of awareness. Like, I see it differently now. I feel it differently now. The same old thing that used to bother me doesn't bother me now. All those are shifts of awareness. And so like Vernon Howard used to teach, the very state of noticing is a state of strength of and by itself. So just being the observer allows the awareness to come in. And that, Greg, that's like 1993 for me. That's like, 25 plus years ago. I remember it like it was yesterday, reading those pages, reading those words on the page. I was ready in that moment to understand and become aware of what those words meant. That's when the higher self kicks in and says, we're good. You're seeing through a lens of pureness rather than of the old stuff that was preventing this freely radiating consciousness that you talk about. And that's just beautiful.
Yeah, it's like an inkling, an intimation, an apperception of the higher self, like one's soul and the meaning of all life, even in the midst of all the pain of the world. There is the beauty of that apperception of the deeper meaning, the belonging. Even in the face of one's own individual beingness that seems separate from everyone else on the planet, or everything else on the planet. There's also, though, that sense of deep connectedness, of belonging, of being a child of the cosmos, and that the apperception of that it builds as one becomes more whole.
Yeah.
And it displaces the hopelessness, the fear, and the dis-ease of the remaining fragmentation.
Yes. Then what I'm getting right now, Greg, is no matter what stage we are at, or those of you that are listening, or wherever you think you're at, by the way, there's always those moments of where we're learning something new. And if you want to learn something new, then you can do what one of my friends in Hawaii called emptying yourself. If you don't know how to empty yourself, ask. Just like close your eyes and say, how can I just release that which doesn't serve me? Or how can I empty myself in this moment and just be open to that which I don't know? In other words, of purity, of light.
Yeah, I think that's the nothingness, the no-thingness that philosophers and metaphysicists speak about.
Yes, yeah. And
the limitless nothing that the Kabbalists.
Right. So what I was saying there was like, let's say if we're beginners, intermediate, or advanced, wherever a person thinks they are, that we still have access to this state of noticing. In other words, becoming the observer, stepping back from the thoughts, the feelings, the emotions. Even if there's fragmentation, can I notice that the part of me isn't feeling quite right? Like, wow, yeah, it might be time for reaching out. This is what I was going to share before. And there's this trap of self-help. If we keep trying to do it for ourselves and not reach out, then we're going to get the same results typically because we can't see our own blind spots. That's what lacunas are. And I can say from experience that the many sessions that I've done over the years, like, oh man, are you kidding, Greg? Like stuff that it helped me see, number one, two, release, and number three, get to the good stuff. Natural life. Like, you mean this was here the whole time? The answer, yes. The real me.
It's what you bring to it.
Yes, exactly. And it's fun. It's self-revealing. It's like that's what Shakespeare taught, to thine own self be true. When you are true to the self at that level, you experience the wholeness, Greg, that you talk about. And it's not the easiest thing in the world, Well, let's just be clear about this. You don't get this by one quick little 10-minute reading of something. Unless, of course, that part is, or that part of you is that clear. But in the model that you're talking about, the many levels of consciousness, the 4 levels that you talk about, it's worth the journey. Yes, I can say that from my own experience. The gifts that it has brought me are better than what I thought I needed, what I was wanting. Like the outcomes, like the better relationship, or the more money, or the all these other things that we think we want. But in the journey to be getting them is what grew our character. It's what revealed our essence. That's the journey. That's the magic, And that's what self-questing does in my experience and what I've seen other people who have experienced it as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very direct way. Certainly meditation. There's so many different approaches one could take, but self-questing is so direct and so quick and so non-forceful, and it's just a matter, again, of what the client brings to the situation. When they're ready, when they're expressing symptoms of pain, they're ready, and, if they're willing to present themselves, that's their part of the journey. The rest is up to the facilitator to guide them, guide them along the trail.
Got it. So, if a person wants to learn more about self-questing, how do they do that?
I have a website, selfquesting.com, and I have a couple of books, Freud's Innuendo and Yamshid's Cup, subtitled The Postmodern Quest for Self in the Shadow of the Newtonian World. It's a mouthful. It's a spin-off from my Ph.D. dissertation, where I go into describing, really answering your question about what is consciousness.
Yeah.
By first going into ancient wisdom and traditions like that, and then also psychology and showing the limits of that, particularly as it developed out of Freud and the medical, the philosophical materialism of his time. And then beyond that goes into more what I call postmodern science, like quantum physics and chaos science, in sort of setting out a blueprint for a new approach to healing the body-mind that is consciousness-based rather than necessarily body-based in its metaphysical outlook and in its approach.
Yeah.
And then another book I wrote is called Butterflies in a Bottle, and that's about it delves into consciousness a little bit, but it focuses more on vibrational tools, particularly essential oils, and how they're able to make these shifts because of their ability to influence on the level of that energetic infrastructure.
Right.
And work so closely to the deep source of consciousness.
Yeah.
And its influence.
And one caveat would be that when the oils are pure, because the stuff that we find typically at stores has been tainted. It's been chemically modified. Yeah. And so source is always the key with the vibration and the purity of those oils. Yes. So when somebody wants to learn self-questing, how do they learn more about that? Like if they want to work with you, or if do you do group work as well, or personal stuff?
I do workshops. You, as you know, you attended one not long ago in Chicago. They tend to be small, 8 to 10 people, and they last about 3 days. And they the small group allows for each person to really have, in each fragment that comes up, have the attention that's needed to process them. And the essential oils are used, of course, in the process, as well as certain other techniques that developed out of eye movement and energy meridian tapping techniques to clear emotional crises and even physical issues.
Yes.
And get to the consciousness that's behind it.
Yeah.
Chi as well that's behind it.
So can a person sponsor you like we did? Into their city.
I'm open to traveling. If you have a group of people that are interested, I have people interested in many locations in the United States and Canada and even beyond. I've done workshops in Europe, and so I'm definitely open to doing that. And the beauty of self-questing, unlike the psychotherapy that I did as a psychotherapist years ago, is that self-questing can be done on the phone. It doesn't work the same way in terms of developing a therapeutic, what therapists call a narcissistic relate bond with the client. It really, rather than developing that kind of dependency on the therapist, self-questing gets them to be whole in themselves directly, and through reconnecting with parts of themselves, they sort of become their own container.
Yeah.
That's the cup of wholeness that contains them.
The cup of wholeness. I like that.
Yeah. So it can be done on the phone quite effectively. And I can't remember, other than the workshops, I can't remember the last time I did a session in person. Nearly 100% of the sessions I do now are over the phone with people all over the world.
Yeah, and I can voice from experience that, they could be amazingly transformational, and you don't have to leave the comfort of your own home. But I was getting to the group work, and so if a person wanted to become skilled in self-questing, do you have like a trainer's module as well? Can people do self-questing for their clients, in other words?
Yeah, as you may recall, in the workshop we did in Chicago not long ago, there was a training for practitioners interleaved with the workshop, and we met an hour earlier each of the 3 days, and then you were given a manual, and then even during the workshop, at times I would segue off and make a few comments about what I was doing in terms of facilitating a person's self-quest process at the time, and I would give a few hints to some of the practitioners there, or practitioners in training, about what I was doing and why.
Yes. And
then after the workshops, I invite people to practice. It's like learning to ride a bike. Practice makes perfect. So, pair up and work on each other, facilitate each other self-questing, do it for friends and relatives, and just get good at it. And feel free to call me. Part of what they pay in the fee for the practitioner training option of the workshop is to have access to me over the phone for any feedback or supervision that they might need if they get stuck in the process or have questions, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And being part of one of those facilitator trainings one time, I remember specifically it was a morning session that you were kind of like sharing the principles or the overview. And I remember like it was so palpable, Greg. The awareness shift in me as I was listening to you, how you saw the process. And I was witnessing one of the people in the group as they were going through a very, very deep catharsis. I mean, as huge a release as I've ever seen ever. I mean, it was really big time. You probably remember the one I'm referring to. And how subtle, how gentle, how compassionate you were, and how that person felt that, and how that part felt that. That's the amazing part. When that part knows that the practitioner has love and compassion, it feels free.
And really all that is it isn't so much what you do, it's what you don't do. You enter that session without memory and desire, even to heal them.
Yes.
So you're not doing anything to force the issue. You're not a human doing, you're a human being.
Yeah.
And you're just present.
Yeah.
You're just present and witnessing with them. And, in a way, you model the behavior. They may be in deep fear. They may be dealing with foreign consciousness that seems pretty weird. Oftentimes their own consciousness that's fragmented is pretty darn dark. But you don't go into fear. There's no need to. It's all just consciousness.
Yes.
And you're bringing them to be aware of something that gives them power over it.
Yes.
Anything in their system they become aware of, they gain power.
Yeah. And as we close here, what I'm thinking of now, and we'll close up in a really up sense, despite these couple of words here. You've shared a phrase with me, and I said, so, like when darkness shows up, what do you suggest? And you said this phrase to me about Lucifer. Can you quote that phrase for people?
Well, other than what's coming to mind is that Lucifer literally translates to bearer of light. And all you need to do, if it's dark, you turn the light on. Turn the awareness on.
Yeah.
Become aware.
Yeah.
And that's the most powerful thing you can do. The darkest foreign consciousnesses that I've run into in facilitating people's self-questing, they split. As soon as you start shining the light on them, They can't tolerate the light of day. They're gone.
That's just awesome. You should see the bright smile on my face when you say that. Like, oh man, yeah. The way I remember,
as long as you don't go into fear, or the client doesn't go strongly into fear, you know, the light's on. You know, as soon as you go into fear, that diminishes the light.
Yeah, the phrase that I remember you saying in another interview that we've done is like, it doesn't matter even if Lucifer shows up in the room. He has no power over your radiant light awareness, in so many words. And when you said it, it was like, you could hear this, like, pew, just utter clarity that like just came across the land. You know? Because if people felt that, there would be no fear. And they would notice what would normally bring up the fear, and they kind of go, cool, no problem.
Yeah.
I understand. You know, I understand your nature. I understand where you come from. And let's talk. Let's have a nice, open conversation now, instead of saying, oh, it's terrible. It's the same fear as yesterday, and of the generational this and that. Like, no.
But that kind of understanding doesn't really come for a lot of people until they've released several fragments.
Yeah.
You know, and gained enough of their own light, their own wholeness.
Right.
So the light's on, you know, and even their own fear then doesn't overwhelm them, take their mind away. You know.
And it answers the question, so what does self-questioning really do? It helps a person experience their own light to the extent that nothing that ever shows up that is unlike themselves, within themselves, could ever hold them back from being themselves.
Right. It's themselves calling to themselves.
Exactly.
If you recognize.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you see it that way, everything that shows up is positive. It tells you something.
Yeah.
It's creating greater awareness. It's turning the light on more.
Sure is. So how would you like to close? What you know, like blessing or a little, you know, a parting gift for people as they listen.
Well, my fondest hope is that for anyone and everyone is that the love with a capital L and oneness with a capital O of all being with a capital A and capital B, capital A on L and B on being, that the love and oneness of all being shines through their hearts and lights their way.
So be it now. Aho.
Aho. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Greg, for your time today, and your love and your spirit and your commitment to this work that helps us remember our own wholeness and our radiance.
It's good to be appreciated.
Yes.
Love your awareness.
Yes. Yes. Thanks again. Aloha to you.
Aloha. Mahalo.
Aloha. Mahalo.